Right-leaning libertarianism is due for a serious critique of how it's played fast and loose with the facts, be they historical, economic, philosophical, what have you. But it's especially been insidious within the so-called men's rights movement. And one of those places some misinformation seems to be making the rounds turns out to be the YouTube channel of anti-feminist activist Karen Straughan. But you can't challenge Karen. She's way smarter than you. What's that guy with the fat face in the video doing trying to critique her? Seems to be the general consensus. Well, I have no doubt that for a woman of average social status who's never really spent too much time in a university, Karen is clearly above average in her intelligence. But her research and carefulness with the facts isn't as sterling as we might expect. Got three examples for you. First, in her video discussing the draft in relation to men's rights, Karen discusses the World War I women's movement known as the White Feather Campaign. She mentions suffragist Christabel Pankhurst, who along with her mother Emmeline, participated in shaming men for not enlisting by giving them a white feather, symbol of cowardice. This leaves the false impression that the white feather movement was largely a feminist phenomenon. She leaves out the following facts. One, most of the women supporting the white feather movement were anti-suffragists. The Pankhurst and their crowd were the exception. Two, Emmeline's own organization, the Women's Social and Political Union, had an odd approach to suffrage. Quote, the main objective was to gain not universal suffrage, the vote for all women and men over a certain age, but votes for women on the same basis as men. This meant winning the vote not for all women, but for only the small stratum of women who could meet the property qualification. As one critic suggested it was not votes for women, but votes for ladies. But all I've ever basically heard was that the issue never was property rights for anybody who is a suffragist. Number three, the suffragist movement was actually split between the supporters of the war and opponents of the war. And the pacifist wing of the feminist community actually wished to remove this conscription requirement among men. Another example. Karen has also been instrumental in tying the concept of the tender years doctrine, which sees women as default caregivers in the child custody case, to feminists like Caroline Norton. Actually, the feminist blame here lies mostly in attempting to legally codify what had already been precedent in the U.S. court system for decades. I wrote this piece on the issue in January of 2014 based on a conversation I had with family law attorney and author Tom James on Peter Wright's gynocentrism.com website. I made a couple of attempts at getting this article to Karen. She seems not to have taken it into account for whatever reason, perhaps just an oversight, but subsequent talks by her on this topic revealed she hadn't modified or clarified her position much. Today, however, I'm mostly concerned with recent misinformation spread by Karen regarding women's suffrage and the welfare state, as indicated by this screenshot from a Janet Bloomfield video, in which she, for some reason, seems to think that Switzerland is a good model for showing what happens to the size of government following the granting of the video to the fairer sex. Now, I've had people ask me, have you heard any other statements more recently that Karen's made in that regard? I have, in terms of how she tends to view the welfare state. We'll go into that in time. But the libertarian wing of the MRAs has been the greatest source of confusion and wrong thinking, based on the tendency of most conservatives to just not fact check themselves. Or maybe some of them actually don't give a shit. It wasn't always this way. In the past, men's issues advocates came from the left side of the spectrum. Journalist and attorney Ernest Belfort Bax was a staunch Marxist socialist. Author Warren Farrell and activist Karen Straughan came out of the feminist movement. David Benatar, as well as Paul Nathanson and Kathy Young, are all highly respected academics. I did a video recently on Karen's blind spot with this suffrage government spending thing a couple of weeks ago. The few who tried to argue with me about it didn't have much to offer in the way of facts that were important, but it did leave me with the impression that I could stand to revise and expand on that video and give further background.
Some of you might be asking, what's an anti-feminist doing speaking at a libertarian forum? You know, what does gender politics have to do with libertarian philosophies? And the answer to that question is kind of complex. For one, gender influences everything, including the size, scope, and decisions of government. Including the size, scope, and decisions of government. Including the size, scope, and decisions of government.
Including the size, scope, and decisions of government.
Now, just how likely do you think it is that women getting the vote is the main driving reason behind such wasteful national security and defense spending like you just saw in copious screenshots verified? When after all, it's Karen herself who says, and I quote,
"Women tended to vote for different policies than men, more welfare and less military spending being the big one."
oh, and don't bother sending me stats to try to show that social spending dwarfs the defense budget. In point of fact, much of what ought to be counted as defense or national security does not get accounted for. As just one example, veterans' benefits are not counted. Another is the fact that the Department of Energy, which manufactures nuclear warheads, think that should be counted with defense? It's not counted in the same pot. You've already seen the screenshots detailing just how above accountability our government thinks it ought to be when it comes to defense spending. But pundits, politicians, and the media constantly harp on the coming financial crisis. And even Obama used the "we're piling up debt for our kids to have to pay off" canard. We seem to not have problems finding cashola for dropping bombs on the next Yemeni children attending a wedding. But Hillary can tell Bernie Sanders a single payer and free college is pie in the sky. If we just ended the war in Afghanistan alone, we could fund just under 1 million students so that they aren't graduating from college with a crushing debt. Now, which do you think is a better investment? Blowing some brown-skinned Middle Eastern country back to the Stone Age, or stemming the tide of private household debt here at home? I wonder. But women votes for the liberal socialist state. All Karen and Janet needed to do was a simple Google search to see why that is by no means universally true. But for some reason, Janet wants to focus on Germany and Karen wants to harp on Switzerland. Speaking of Germany, a little research also shows that women had nothing to do with Germany's social services, since Otto von Bismarck's reforms were all in place before women got the right to vote. Same thing with the foundations of the welfare state in the UK. I talked to a couple of guys that hang around in MRA circles who are from the UK, and they verified that. Just ask anyone from the UK. Now, if any of you want to ask Karen for her reference on Switzerland, be my guest. I think you could just be better off Googling Swiss welfare state, and you'll find it's quite an acceptable situation for countries with mostly rich people in residence. I personally am not interested. For one thing, this women vote equal government grows canard doesn't appear to be a pattern that you can find repeated in all countries at all times. In fact, most of them. To be brutally honest, it just appears that Karen is looking for a connection to make,
This is how I see
whether
progressive
it's
MRAs.
actually there
In an
or
attempt
not.
to help men,
So just
they
remember,
advocate for the
when you hear
redistribution
bullshit
of more
like,
and more of men's hard-earned money.
Gender influences everything, including the size, scope, and decisions
or
of government.
airheaded, irresponsible drivel like, just ignore it. Tell those people that taxes for revenue are obsolete and that it's actually not your money, honey. And besides, the government spending money seems to help people get along in a civilized society rather than have to make breakfast in the wild, wild west. So I fail to see the problem. If that doesn't work, send them this link to a libertarian who actually bothered to look into the claims made by advocates of modern monetary theory for himself and found out, golly gosh, we're right. There's a lot more to be said, lots of questions, arguments, comments, and buts to deal with in time. But as you can imagine, this is quite a long haul for me to produce. So whilst I could anticipate all the nonsense about the dollar devaluating and the impending global economic crisis, I'll just have to leave that for another day. Please check the videos I have mirrored on this channel regarding economics and the monetary system, and ciao for now.